Logging into Imigact and accessing the Competence-Based Extension interface. The work of competence-based extension of Imigact to a new language is performed by native speaker informants. These informants receive a username and password that authorize them to process data for their language only. The informant will log in and will have access to the part of the Imigact infrastructure which is dedicated to competence-based extension. In principle, any browser should be compatible with the infrastructure, but we strongly advise the use of Firefox or Chrome, which have been thoroughly tested. In addition, the latest version of Flash should be installed. We are now accessing as a Spanish or Chinese informant. After logging in, the informant will choose the Scene Metadata menu. The informant will be redirected to the Competence-Based Extension Interface, or CBE interface, which represents the IDs and thumbnail images of all the scenes, each identifying one separate action concept in the ontology. 10 scenes are listed on each page. On the right side of each scene, the informant will see the English and Italian verbs mapped onto that scene in the corpus-based annotation. Moreover, he will see the processing status of each scene in all languages that have been opened for processing Imigact concepts in Imigact for All. In order to start processing, the informant will click on the ID and access the full set of metadata for that concept. The informant cannot modify the information on this page that concerns other languages. Only the lines corresponding to his language can be edited. The language for each line is identified by a flag. The first necessary operation is to properly appreciate the action represented in the video. The informant will play the video by clicking on it and will observe the represented action. It is clearer and more informative to play it full screen. Once he understands the referred action, the informant will provide the verb or verbs in his language that can be used to refer to that specific action. The lemma should be annotated in its infinitival form, as it is commonly reported in dictionaries. The informant will annotate this lemma or lemmas in the box corresponding to his language on the bottom of the page. As an example, this is the lemma chosen by the Spanish informant for this action. For each lemma, he will then write in the caption box a simple sentence in the present tense, filling all the arguments of the verb that properly describe the action. This sentence will be used as the caption of the scene in the language of the informant. Both the verb and the caption must be written in the current writing system of the language of the informant. If this system does not use Roman characters, after the annotation in the current writing system, the informant will also provide the verb and its caption in Roman characters. He or she will write it in the respective transliteration boxes, as in this Chinese example. Saving and editing the work. For each scene, once the work on verbs and captions is completed, the informant ticks the box corresponding to Work Done. To return to the list of scenes to be processed, the informant then clicks on the link Save and Back to List. The box and link are located on the left side of the screen. The infrastructure does not allow any editing of verbal lemmas, captions, or transliterations after a new line is inserted or the work is saved. If the informant needs to modify something, or she changes her judgment on the applicability of the verb, she must delete the entire line, using the red X on the right. She may then write it again in the correct manner if needed. For instance, in the figure shown, the applicability of the last verb is highly doubtful in Spanish, and moreover, a typing error occurred. Pener instead of poner. Therefore, the informant will delete the line by clicking on the X. If she wants, she can write it again in a corrected manner on a new line. She will then save and go back to the list of scenes. Continuing the work. After clicking Save and Back to List, the infrastructure will take the informant to the first page of the list. To continue working, the annotator will ask the infrastructure to give him the scenes which remain to be processed. The easiest way to do this is to select the language and then click on the search button. For instance, when the box for Chinese is ticked, the infrastructure will immediately return the scenes that are still to be processed for this language. Sharing the work. There may be more than one annotator at a time working on one language. However, the infrastructure does not allow, at least in this release, collaborative work or evaluation for consensus on the possible verb assignments by different annotators. In Imigact, we foresee that the work on one language will be under the responsibility of one supervisor, who will revise the choices once the annotation has been completed by one or more native speaker informants. The supervisor can track his revisions on one Excel file for scientific purposes. The work on one language is made accessible on the Imigact query interface once the supervisor gives his OK. Requirements for the annotation. Choice of verb. When the informant assigns a verb to one action type, this verb can identify the action in its proper meaning. No metaphorical sense or idiomatic usage is allowed. The task is not defining the action, but only finding the verbs of the language that in principle could be used to refer to that action. The informant is not requested to specify which verb is the best to express the action, which is the most precise, or which is the most probable lemma to be used for that action. For instance, the verb to put is not the most probable and does not define the action below, but in accordance with the semantic competence of native speaker informants, it can be applied to this action and is therefore one of the verbs to be annotated. Ambiguity. Although the scenes in Imigact have been scripted and filmed in order to be as unambiguous as possible and to convey one sole meaning, some ambiguity is still possible and can lead to misunderstanding or overinterpretation by the informant. To avoid this risk, the informant must reach a clear understanding of the specific action that we want to represent in each occasion. For instance, in this case, the informant could say that the represented action is not only to lead, but also to help or to cross. Beyond taking and bringing, we could also say that an act of giving occurred. However, these alternative categorizations fall outside the domain of Imigact. The informant should identify the specific physical action that is intended in the film. For example, to help is not a physical action. Moreover, to identify the action, one needs to distinguish it from its consequences. For instance, crossing and giving are consequences of bringing, taking, and leading, and are beyond what is intended by this video. The possible alternatives must always be verbs that identify the physical action in a simultaneous manner. Giving is not simultaneous to bringing. This level of ambiguity can sometimes be found among the Imigact scenes, and the scenes should be carefully evaluated to arrive at the appropriate interpretation for the goals of Imigact. Suggested verbs and the preferred language of the informant. In order to provide reliable, competence-based judgments, the informant must be a native speaker of the language she is implementing. In the case of languages that cannot be acquired in the natural process of language acquisition, for example, Latin, Sanskrit, or Classic Arabic, she must be an expert and frequent user of this language, ensuring a full appreciation of the possible uses of the action-oriented lexicon. In order to exploit the suggestions for alternatives provided by the annotation, she must also know, at least at a very basic level, English or one of the languages already implemented in Imigact, at this point Italian, Spanish, or Chinese. This is necessary for the following reason. As far as one verb can refer to more than one action, One action can also be identified by more than one verb. More specifically, two verbs with different meanings can identify the same action. For instance, in English, the following action can be equivalently identified with to take or to bring. This is true also in Spanish, which equivalently picks up this action with the verbs llevar and alcanzar. This is one of the more relevant properties of the linguistic identification of actions, and the informant must be well aware of it. Therefore, the informant is not requested to annotate only one verb fitting with the represented action, but is invited to find more than one sole possible option allowed by his language. However, the viewing of one film may not be sufficient to elicit all alternatives. The informant is not requested to provide the complete range of possible verbs in his language that can refer to that action, but only to consider this possibility. It is not a problem if no alternative comes to mind. However, the infrastructure provides one simple means to stimulate the thinking of the informant. Frequently, in the corpus-based annotation, more verbs have already been found in English and Italian that can represent the scene. Moreover, in the previous competence-based extensions, other alternatives in many languages have been provided. These alternatives should function as suggestions for figuring out alternatives in the language of the informant. This opportunity should be exploited in a systematic manner during the workflow after the first option has been determined. For instance, the first verb which came to the mind of the Spanish annotator for this action was the verb colgar, or to hang in English. However, looking at the English annotation, he could see that this event can also be identified by the verb to put in English. So the Spanish informant could figure out that also in Spanish, other verbs that are similar to put can be properly applied. Meter, poner. The annotator is only requested to judge whether or not the alternatives suggested by other languages can in principle be accepted and used in referring to the event in question. In this case, he will report a new verbal lemma and a new caption by adding a line to his language options. He does this by clicking on the green plus button on the right. As a consequence of this workflow requirement, the informant must be able to appreciate at least some of the lexical choices provided by previous work. That is, he must know some English or at least one of the other implemented languages. It is not necessary that the informant consider the full set of language information. This could cause a lot of confusion and would be very time-consuming. In order to deal properly with the competence-based extension task, the suggested information should come from one or at maximum two languages, which the informant should choose beforehand according to his preference. A hide languages function will be implemented soon in order to reduce the amount of information shown on the web page.